Okay, so today we're going to talk about the endocrine system, and this is a continuation of our overall discussion about control systems. So these systems, the nervous system and the endocrine system, coordinate, regulate, and control all the other body systems. So with the endocrine system, there's a variety of endocrine organs throughout our body, and there's a couple of different ways to categorize them. Okay? We can categorize endocrine structures as being central versus peripheral. So, central endocrine structures are located within the central nervous system. That includes things like the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the pineal gland. Okay? These are all central endocrine structures. They're located within the brain. And then we have peripheral endocrine structures, things like the structures like the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, okay, the thymus. And then we can also categorize endocrine structures as being dedicated endocrine structures, meaning that's their only function is to produce hormones, or endocrine structures with mixed function. So, for example, the kidneys have multiple jobs. They are an endocrine structure with mixed function. So, in addition to their job as a filtering organ, they also produce erythropoietin, which controls red blood cell production. They also produce an enzyme called renin that's released into the bloodstream and acts like a hormone. And the same goes for the digestive system. The digestive tract, at a variety of points along the digestive tract, we have endocrine glands that produce numerous hormones. Most regulate digestive function. And actually, we talk quite a lot about that in digestion. So, two major ways of categorizing endocrine structures is central versus peripheral, dedicated versus mixed function. Now, when we talk about a substance being a hormone, that has a very specific definition. When we also talk about a cell or a structure being an endocrine structure, that also has a narrow definition. So, an endocrine cell is a cell that releases a chemical mediator, okay, directly into the bloodstream. And that chemical mediator we call a hormone. Okay? So a hormone, by definition, is a chemical mediator released into the bloodstream. And that hormone gets into general circulation and it travels throughout the body, and it's designed to act on a target cell that is located at quite a distance from the secreting cell. Sometimes the endocrine cell happens to be a neuronal cell, like the central endocrine glands that are located within the central nervous system. In that case, they are still called endocrine. Sometimes they're called neurosecretory or a neuroendocrine cell. But their hormones are still called hormones. Okay? Sometimes it's called a neurohormone, but usually just a hormone. And that hormone is still acting, getting into the bloodstream, distributing widely, and acting on target cells that are far away. Okay? And now that pattern of endocrine release is very different from the pattern of neurotransmitter release that we have studied previously, where a neuronal cell releases a chemical mediator into a synaptic cleft that is designed to act on a very nearby adjacent cell. Okay. So even though the identity of the chemical mediator might be the same, right? So a substance can be released in this pattern, this neurotransmitter pattern, and we'll call it a neurotransmitter. But the same exact molecule can be released in a hormonal pattern, and we'll call it a hormone. Okay? So it really depends on the pattern of release. Now, there's a important concept when we talk about endocrinology, and it's the idea that every hormone in the body exerts its actions on target cells via binding to a hormone receptor. Okay? So there's this very important hormone receptor relationship. So the effect that a hormone will have on a target cell is entirely dependent on the receptor it binds to. And many hormones have multiple receptor types on different target cells that bring about very, very different effects. So one hormone can actually bring about a multitude of effects on the body based on the receptor it binds to and the effect it has on the target cell. So in order for the hormone to exert an effect on the target cell and bring about some physiological response, okay, the hormone binds to the receptor, and the receptor triggers some sort of intracellular event. Okay? And that intracellular event is what brings about the physiological response. So let's see some examples of intracellular events. Number one is it alters the permeability of some ion channel. Okay? So a hormone binds to a receptor, and basically altering the permeability just means that the hormone, when it binds to the receptor, opens or closes the channel. Okay? And if it opens the channel, then it's allowing ions to pass through, and that is going to result in a change in membrane potential. Okay? And that change in membrane potential is what's going to bring about the physiological response. Okay? So you can imagine maybe a hormone is gating, right? It binds to a receptor and it opens a sodium channel, for example. And then that allows sodium to enter the cell, and that's going to cause the cell to, let's say, depolarize and fire an action potential if it can. And the action potential is what's going to bring about that physiological response. So that's one example. Another common intracellular event that hormones trigger is it activates second messenger systems. Okay? And we'll look at this a little bit more closely. But second messenger systems are intracellular signaling systems that tend to alter the activity of pre-existing proteins. So we have these proteins, oftentimes enzymes, that are in the side of the cell, and they get turned on or turned off based on they get turned on or turned off when a hormone binds to the cell. Okay. And then the third common pattern of activity is that when the hormone binds to the receptor, it's actually going to control the expression of genes and the production of new proteins. Okay. So a hormone can bind to a receptor and it can trigger the transcription and translation of a gene and the production of new proteins. And that is going to be what's going to bring about the physiological response. So we'll see this in greater detail when we talk about hormone target cell interactions a little bit later. So hormones come in three basic chemical types. Okay? We have hormones that are polypeptide chains or proteins. Okay? Usually when a hormone is composed of just a small number of amino acids, we tend to refer to that as a peptide rather than a protein. Proteins normally have very, very, very long chains of amino acids. And usually the hormones, the ones that act as hormones, are much shorter in length. So we have peptide or protein-based hormones. We have, similar to that, are amino acid-derived hormones, but they're different than the polypeptide hormones because they usually involve a single amino acid that's been altered somehow. And then the third major class of hormones are steroid hormones. And the most important distinction, the most important differentiating feature with these three types of hormones is whether the hormone is water soluble or lipid soluble. Okay? Because whether a hormone is water soluble or lipid soluble is going to greatly affect how the hormone is produced, hormone synthesis. It's going to affect how it's stored in the cell or by the body, and it's going to affect how it moves through circulation, and it's going to greatly affect how that hormone interacts with the target cell. Okay? And generally speaking, peptide hormones and amino acid derived hormones are water soluble. So these guys tend to be water soluble. And the steroid hormones are all lipid soluble. So generally speaking, okay, with some exceptions, the water soluble hormones, which usually include the protein and amino acid derived hormones. In terms of hormone synthesis, they often are produced in these long chains of amino acids that are inactive, and we call those pre or pro hormones. And usually there's a process of cleaving excess amino acids from the structure in order to activate or release that active hormone. So look at that as we go through. And then in terms of hormone storage, it's much easier to store water-soluble hormones because they are often just produced and then stored in intracellular vesicles. In terms of transport, also water-soluble hormones, they're very easy to transport because they are usually free in plasma since they're water-soluble. And in terms of interaction with target cells, water-soluble hormones can't cross the plasma membrane, so they must bind to surface receptors at the plasma membrane. And that means that they often use second messenger systems. And the second messenger, that term, refers to the fact that the water-soluble hormone is the first messenger, and since it can't cross the membrane, it has to act through a second messenger that lives inside the cell. And then for fat-soluble hormones, usually steroid hormones, they are all synthesized from cholesterol. All steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol. They are, it's a harder business storing steroid hormones because you can't put them into vesicles. They will diffuse out of vesicles. So they're often either not stored or they're made on demand, okay? Or they're stored in creative ways, and we'll talk about some of that later. I won't go into it right now. In terms of hormone transport, these fat-soluble hormones have to be bound to plasma proteins in order to be transported through the circulatory system. Okay? They're not water-soluble, they can't be free in plasma. And in terms of interacting with a target cell, however, steroid hormones diffuse across the plasma membrane. So their receptors are usually inside of the cell. In fact, for almost every steroid hormone, they possess what we call a nuclear receptor, where the receptor is in the nucleus, and that receptor is going to regulate the expression of a gene inside the nucleus. Okay? So those are the general rules, and we'll talk about exceptions, and we'll elaborate as we go through.